The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic and beloved video game franchises today. Despite this, the 1989 cartoon has a heavily negative reputation. In this video, in order to see if that's justified, I'm going to review each episode, give it a score, and then talk about the season in general at the end. Anyway, without any further ado, every episode of Legend of Zelda reviewed. Episode 1, The Ringer. When Ganon learns that there is to be an amateur magician's contest in the Castle of Hyrule, he sees his chance. This episode begins with Link lamenting his position as protector of Hyrule, as all good heroes do. This isn't all that Link does in this opening scene, as we also get the first of many questionable Link advances towards Zelda. I get that Link in this series isn't exactly a typical heroic guy, but it would help if the protagonist of the series was not a total creep. Anyway, Sprite the Fairy sucks, and we move on to the first fight of the episode. Now, this fight scene shares a lot in common with many throughout the show, being its main flaw, speed. While the creativity in combat may be fairly decent, and the choreography equally so, the fight is just so slow. Like, I get it, it's cheaper and more realistic, but in a battle against orcs and human, you really should show Link being much faster than his opponent, something completely missed in this one. Anyway, Zelda's abuse towards Link is fun to see, and we get our first non-intro example of...
Excuse me, princess.
This gag seems way worse out of context if you haven't seen the show, but I'll get into why a little bit later. Anyway, I talked a ridiculous amount about the first scene of the show, so let's go ahead and talk about Ganon. The show can't really decide whether or not Ganon should be seen as a real villain or more of a joke one. Like, first he kills his own henchman for not obtaining the Triforce, but then his next move is to join an amateur magician's contest? It's just a bit strange, and at least in this episode, Ganon remains a pretty poorly written villain. The gags with the loser magicians are the only funny part of the episode, as it transitions into the second fight, Link versus the dragon. This one's pretty bland too, although this sequence is a bit clever. The last enjoyable part of the episode, of which there has been few, is watching Sprite get slammed into a wall. The tree transition to the next fight is a little bit clever, but it somehow ends up being the worst one in the episode. Tying the protagonists together makes the fight even slower, and in another trend in the series, Link's sword beams, or whatever they're actually called, makes the fight just feel stiff and boring. Ganon's defeat is very anticlimactic, and Link basically forcing Zelda to kiss him, while certainly trying to be written as playful, comes off as more creepy than anything. Overall, this episode is bad. The animation and music are somewhat fine, albeit the music is poorly mixed, but the fights are terribly slow, the writing is abysmal, the comedy is absent, and every single character is either painfully boring or impeccably unlikable. Episode 2, Cold Spells. When it's spring cleaning time in the castle, Link pretends to have a cold in order to get out of doing work. Yeah, this episode really doesn't focus that heavily on Link and Zelda, instead devoting a large portion of the first half to Sprite. That means until about the halfway point, there are no fights, jokes, or enjoyment to be had. I think I touched on it in the last review, but now feels like a good time to go in depth. Sprite is just annoying. The voice is eruptionally high, the writing is eruptionally low, and it just kind of feels like somebody saw Tinkerbell and made a character based solely on her appearance. And her attraction towards Link is almost as creepy as his towards Zelda. Anyway, into the first fight, if you can even call it that. Watching Zelda and Link fight sheets and buckets is about as exciting as one might imagine. This is the only thing close to a fight this episode, though things are not boding well for the final showdown with Ganon. It's honestly really strange to let Ganon possess both Triforces in the second episode, but who cares anymore? Sprite shoots lasers or something, and Zelda shoots Ganon or something, and just stands next to the Triforce of Power, deciding not to take it, and this episode is just not very good. I know I kind of breezed through this one, but it has every flaw of the last episode. Poor audio mixing, poor recycling of songs, the story is terrible, Link is awful, Sprite is annoying, animation is stiff, choreography is slow, and the comedy is non-existent. It's still not looking great for this series. Episode 3, The White Knight. When the handsome Prince Facade shows up in Hyrule, Zelda cannot keep her eyes off of him, and Link is green with jealousy. The beginning of this episode is actually pretty solid. Link and Zelda have a conversation that's not creepy for once, and the action scene that follows is not that bad. Good choreography, smooth animation, and a decent pace make it the best one of the series so far. Alrighty, this episode is off to a fantastic start as we go and meet...
I am Prince Facade from Arcadia.
Oh, come on, his name is actually Prince Facade. Subtlety is not this episode's strong suit, and unfortunately, I'm not sure what actually is. Until this point, Zelda has been the only character of the cast that is somewhat likable. So of course, this episode takes time to make Zelda join the rest of the cast as insufferable. Zelda completely ignoring Link, who has saved her life time and time again, purely because of Prince Facade's looks, is just bonkers. Whatever though, if you can move past the fact that we're down to 0 likable characters, you can make it to more Zelda and Facade stuff. Zelda is supposed to be the smart one of the cast, hence why she has the Triforce of Wisdom, so the fact that she can't see through Prince Facade's facade is just frustrating. I don't feel like I even need to comment on Sprite perving on Link, so let's just skip that and move on to whatever this scene is. Why is this scene here? I don't know, but it feels like a time waster that's only purpose is to drive in the fact that Zelda is irredeemable. Link bailing on protecting Hyrule because Zelda is being mean to him would be worth complaining about, but we have 10 more episodes of this, so let's just move on to the last fight. Oh, wait, there isn't actually a last fight? Facade's refusal to get into the mud is as awkward as can be, and the only redeemable part of this whole sequence is that Link doesn't have a moment where he forgives Zelda before saving her. The last moment between Link and Zelda isn't all that terrible, but that doesn't even begin to save this train wreck. Facade's look of total indifference matches the show's indifference towards being enjoyable. And oh yeah, Ganon is in this episode. I didn't mention it because it doesn't matter. It just kind of feels like there was a Ganon quota in each episode, and as soon as they hit it, they can move on to the story that they actually wanted to tell. Going into this episode, the first 5 minutes made me believe that I could give this episode a different score. I was wrong. Episode 4, Kiss and Tell. When Link rescues a fair maiden from a ferocious dragon, he gets a kiss as his reward. So you probably have a solid guess on how good this episode is. And surprisingly, you're probably incorrect. This episode's actually good. I know it's hard to believe, so let's go ahead and break down this miracle from the first scene. It turns out that Link and Zelda have the best chemistry when he's not around. The jokes cracked at Link's expense are actually funny, and Zelda's unamused attitude towards the entire situation is extremely comical. And surprisingly, once Link shows up, the scene gets even better. The dragon's one-liners as he's defeated work really well too, and the entire scene is pulled together with Zelda's reactions. From angrily eating a banana to turning around when Link goes for a kiss, it's honestly the best scene of the show so far by far. The only problem I have is that they missed a perfect opportunity for Zelda to say, "Excuse me, princess." Despite the literal plot of this episode, and this is going to sound dumb, but Zelda really largely avoids being the damsel in distress in this one. Like, yeah, she does literally become a damsel in distress, but she defeats both enemies at the start and holds her own against Ganon really well. The best thing this episode does regarding Zelda is actually make her a good friend. The show definitely feels like it could go in the direction of Zelda refusing to kiss Link or even help him because of his frog status, but no, she actually offers to kiss him. While Ganon is just a stereotypical big bad in this one, the other characters are great, just like Link and Zelda. Okay, calling Sprite in this episode great is a bit of a stretch, but this is the first episode where she's somewhat tolerable. She even gets the funniest line.
What is this, Ugly People Day?
The ending is somewhat satisfying too, giving Link a way back to humanity without forcing the princess not to kiss him. Link not being upset with Sprite is fantastic, and I thought the use of the bug eating bit to break up the final kiss is great too. Overall, this episode's actually good. Not like so bad it's good, but an actual funny episode with characters you can get someone invested in. That's not to say there aren't any flaw, the music still repeats frequently and is mixed poorly, and the action could definitely still use some work, but maybe I'm just getting so used to seeing terrible episodes, but this one is so clearly a step above everything else the show has to offer. Episode 5, Sing for the Unicorn. You think a king would be safe standing on top of his own castle, but not when Ganon has managed to capture a flying unicorn. This episode surprisingly doesn't feature any Sprite. In other good news, the first scene of the episode works really well. While it definitely feels like Link just creeping on Zelda once again, the comments from Zelda's father and Zelda actually appreciating Link's gesture both make the scene actually enjoyable. I think I've identified the shifts between the third and fourth episodes that has vastly improved the show, and it's that Zelda actually likes Link now. Now, instead of Link just being the worst, these two characters actually have a semblance of chemistry together. Another factor that ties this episode together is the king, who is filled with great lines. His complete apathy towards Link is hilarious, and so is his complete disregard of Ganon's threat. Once the characters make their way to Ganon's lair, the episode does begin to go downhill a bit. It never becomes completely unwatchable, but there are 3 main problems I have from this point on. For starters, the scene where they just kind of randomly touch statues is a bit off. Like Zelda asking why she shouldn't touch them as she's already touching them feels weird for her generally intelligent character. Similarly, while the design is sick, everything else about Sing totally blows. Link's attraction to her weird Scooby-Doo reveal that doesn't work because the whole point of Scooby-Doo reveal is that you know the person under the mask, and the fact that she stops fighting when she shows up, and it all kind of contributes to a great character design that is massively underutilized. Finally, and this one's more nitpicking than the other two, but Zelda just screams so much in this one. Whether she's just plain screaming, which is always the same recording, or yelling,
Daddy! 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 Daddy!
It's never pleasant on the ears. But besides those three things, the rest of the episode plays really well. The wind stuff is sudden but neat, and the ending, while definitely rushed, still feels satisfying enough. Overall, while definitely not as strong as the last episode, this one is still leagues ahead of the first two. Besides some minor pacing issues, this is an enjoyable 15 minutes. Episode 6, That Sinking Feeling. Ganon has a new toy, an overworld magnet, capable of pulling any object in the overworld down to the underworld. Following in the last two episodes' footsteps, this is yet another really enjoyable 15 minutes. It's such a stark contrast between the first 3 episodes and the last 3 episodes of Link and Zelda. These characters actually have chemistry now, and besides just making the conversations between them tolerable, it also dramatically increases the quality of the fights. The one against the spider creatures is better in concept than execution, as almost every fight in the series is, but it still works as a fun opener, although the screaming issues from Zelda bleed into this one a bit. Speaking of Zelda, her more aggressive attitude towards Ganon is a really fun direction to take her character in this episode. Watching her bounce off Link as they push into the castle is really fun to watch, and the use of Sprite and the King as purely comedic relief works well enough. This episode is pretty similar to the last one structurally, but suffers very few of the same pitfalls. The final scene is probably the weakest part of the episode, as the magic bracelet is almost a parody of Deus Ex Machina, and the weird excuse not to grab the other Triforce is strange too, but still, this episode is just a better version of the last one. Link and Zelda have more chemistry than ever, the fights, while still slow, take a serious step up in creativity, and the other main characters are utilized well. When an episode is just a better version of an already good one, you know it's great. Episode 7, Underworld Connections. Ganon's evil creatures attack the castle and break the Triforce into 3 pieces. This episode serves as a quick step back from the consistently good episodes we've gotten for a bit. I'm not saying that it's nearly as terrible as the first 3, but from the beginning, this feels like an episode that belongs earlier in the season. Of course, Link isn't as creepy nor Zelda as creeped out, but scenes like the sleepwalking stuff is just really off-putting. The Triforce just being able to be broken into connected pieces feels a bit too manufactured for this specific plot, and the episode slows down tremendously once we get to that part. Zelda being upset at Link for zapping the creatures with no alternative is odd, and we get a set of decisions this episode makes that I honestly can't figure out my opinion on. For starters, the episode definitely features the most video gamey stuff so far. From enemies dropping bombs out of nowhere to Ganon needing exactly 3 hits to defeat, this one feels more like a cartoon based on a game than any of the ones before. The other thing this episode does is feature a ridiculous amount of excuse me princesses. Both of these do the same thing for the episode, making it feel cheesier. So while this does make the episode less engaging, it also adds a bit to its 80s charm. So in general, while I think that these don't directly affect the episode's overall quality, the subpar action throughout the first 13 minutes definitely does. Besides Link's 6 shield serving at the end of the episode, which insert obvious Breath of the Wild joke here, the action in this episode underwhelms. There are cool moments like Zelda saving Link, but a lot of struggle zap. Anyway, the ending of this episode, as I mentioned before, features the best action start of this episode and a somewhat tolerable moment between protagonists. So yeah, while I wish this episode was just slightly worse so I could make the easiest water level joke of my life, this one was just slightly subpar. Nothing too terrible or spectacular in this one, so it ends up as kind of a blend of the first 3 and last 3 episodes. It's going to be interesting to see what direction the second half of the season goes in. Episode 8, Doppelganger. When Zelda finds a huge and beautiful mirror in her room, she naturally assumes that it's a present from Link. This episode is a doozy to try to give an opinion on. For starters, I love some things about this episode. I really like the concept, I like how Link is nearly immediately able to not only figure out the mirror Zelda is fake, but to completely analyze the situation and formulate a plan, and I like how actual Zelda is given a hero's role this time around, saving the day much more than Link actually does. The ending, while incredibly cheesy, isn't that horrendous either, as the episode keeps it lighthearted enough that it's funnier than anticlimactic. So yeah, there's a full positive only run through this episode. Now let's go to the negative side of things. The episode's riddled with errors, from lip syncing being off to the wrong Zelda talking. This episode just feels rough, even when compared to other episodes in this show. Similarly, the action is just off this time, feeling almost out of sync with the episode. It's hard to explain, but the fights just feel like they don't fit the setting or moment in the story. Link also consistently makes the decision not to zap fake Zelda until the story calls for it. So yeah, a lot of good, a lot of bad, and a lot of mediocrity in this one. And I think the episode is just that, average. Episode 9, Stinging a Stinger. Link rescues an old man named Sleaze Nose from attackers in the woods. I think it's pretty easy to guess the general vibe of this episode by simply referencing the name of the old man in the synopsis. For starters, it's somewhat cool to see Link fight something that he can't actually zap from the get-go, which obviously becomes the trend for the rest of the episode. Speaking of being unable to zap, Link somehow being scammed, or as this episode loves to put it, stung into not only taking some random sword, but giving his away is just odd. Like, I get it, Link's generally the muscle and Zelda the brain, but for someone who almost exclusively uses his sword to zap enemies rather than slash, wouldn't the already ambiguously magic sword you have be a better option? Sleazenose is honestly just hilarious this entire episode though. Giving him as a bad person with no redemption arc is a fantastic choice and leads to a great ending, but I'll get to that later, as first we have to talk about some of, if not the, best action of the show so far. The fight against the Goma is just really creatively choreographed, it's fun to watch, features some great dialogue, and has a satisfying conclusion. Speaking of the dialogue, Zelda and Link completely carry this episode. While it's been apparent through these reviews, this episode does a fantastic job of showing just how far their chemistry in the show has come in just 9 episodes. Seriously, the same chemistry that caused back-to-back-to-back 1 out of 5s is now saving entire episodes. As the episode goes in kind of a weird direction with bees or mud or whatever, our protagonists make the episodes worth watching. Anyway, enough gushing about these guys, the bug preparation scene is just kind of wild to watch. It feels like the bug line is a joke, but then just kind of goes longer and longer until the characters are stuffing anthills in boxes. The final encounter with Ganon is a bit too short for me, but without Link's sword, I guess you can't have too much of a fight, so let's just go ahead and move on to the final scene, which is not only my favorite of the episode, but my favorite of the show so far. The reveal that Zelda predicted Sleevenose's portrayal is fantastic, and the fact that they showed the anthill before and let the audience forget about it works really well. But my favorite part has to be Zelda bragging about it and laughing with Link to close the episode. There's a great character moment for the princess and the hero, but I think I've talked about those two enough for this review. Anyway, while every body in my bone wanted to give this episode a perfect score, unfortunately the wacky setup and weird bug fight keeps it from obtaining one. Still, the best episode of the bunch so far, filled with great fights, great gags, and easily the best Zelda and Link episode of the first 9. Here's to hoping the last 4 can match its quality. Episode 10, Hitch in the Works. Since there's little activity from Ganon's minions, Link is assigned chores by the princess. Okay, I might have jumped the gun a little bit when declaring that the show has turned over a new leaf. This episode, while not unwatchable, is not good. For starters, it harkens back to the first 2 episodes where Link is the absolute worst. There's a new character in this one with a quite fitting name. Doof is somewhat funny, somewhat annoying, and completely useless. He's seemingly only in this episode for the ending bit, so we'll go ahead and move on to Link's plan. Link's plan this episode is to convince the princess that Moblins are trying to kidnap her so that she lets him skip his chores. In case you've lost some brain cells listening to me talk about the Zelda cartoon for this long, this plot is absolutely ridiculous. Ganon enters this episode about halfway through, with his plan being to marry the princess. If you can get Zelda to do literally anything, wouldn't it be easier to just tell her to go get the Triforce? Anyway, as you can tell, this episode's kind of light on sense, so let's just go ahead and skip through some boring skeleton fights, skip through the same Ganon fight we've seen like 6 times now, and get to the best part of the episode. As I mentioned a bunch in the last review, Zelda and Link's chemistry is the only thing saving the show. So while for the first 14 and a half minutes it's absolutely awful, it's good enough in the end to save this episode from being completely terrible. I'm not gonna lie and say this episode is a disgrace or anything, but it's definitely the weakest one since the split in quality at episode 4. Episode 11, Fairies in the Spring. King Harkonnen decides to build a royal water park.
Phew! It certainly is hot today, isn't it, Daddy?
Okay, this is actually the easiest water level joke of my life. The only problem is, this episode's actually really good. To start off with the obvious, there's no Ganon. So while his theme does play multiple times throughout, something that I hope was a misdirect and not just to reuse the song, Ganon and his minions don't actually show up in this episode. That means, instead of seeing the same exact fights we've seen over and over and over again, we actually get some new and original stuff. The settings for this episode are beyond fantastic, with the water park fitting the episode surprisingly well, the underwater section giving the episode a completely unique look, and the titular spring being a fantastic background. Back to the underwater section again. Obviously the show being from the 80s doesn't help, but the scene underwater just oozes charm. Speaking of charm, this is yet another fantastic Link and Zelda episode. The relationship is at its best here, and because of the fantastic chaotic fights and actual decent mystery, it doesn't have to carry the episode. And when it doesn't have to carry the episode, it just makes it feel that much better. Zelda is uniquely independent this episode, saving Link on multiple occasions and doing some sick spells with the Triforce. Back to the mystery I mentioned before, I was actually caught off guard by it. In fact, I was already thinking of ways to make fun of the fact that it's obviously Ganon while watching, before feeling really dumb when they reveal the twist. Finally, the ending is really fun too, and while still annoying, I don't hate Sprite as much this episode. Overall, and I can't believe I'm saying this episode is truly fantastic. Not just for the show, but in general. While it certainly suffers from many of the show's perennial issues, it's hard not to give this episode a perfect score. Episode Episode 12, The Moblins Are Revolting. Ganon's new wand makes bubbles around its victims that can only be popped by the Triforce of Power. After the last episode, it only makes sense that this one wouldn't be nearly as good. You've probably picked up on something that I've been praising since about the halfway mark, Zelda and Link. These two characters are pretty much the only characters with character, so to make this episode's characteristic that it largely lacks this character, just like this joke, is not very good. That's not to say that Zelda and Link aren't in this one at all, or even that they're not great in it. While seeing Link's carelessness cause Zelda the Triforce of Power is a bit disappointing, at least Zelda doesn't forgive him for it at the end. And while Link being a bit more remorseful would have been appreciated, he does at least clearly feel a little bit bad. Anyway, enough of these guys, let's talk about Ganon and his monsters. So the main joke here is that the monsters are dumb. That's pretty much it. While Ganon is pouting in his bubbles, his minions are all failing at cartoonish ways. It's not bad per se, but it is certainly boring. Ganon's display of power at the end is neat, but it's a bit unsatisfying. If there's anything to praise this episode for, it's its placement in the show. This episode actually originally aired as a finale, although production order insinuates that it's supposed to be placed here. Setting it here makes a lot more sense, allowing for a Link and Zelda-centric ending while still giving this episode plenty of time to set up. So yeah, a pretty insignificant episode, one that has some interesting ideas, but fails to be more entertaining than boring. Episode 13, The Missing Link. Ganon comes up with a new wand to counter Link and Zelda's magical weapons' power over his monsters. Alright, finale time. Well, this definitely was not meant to be a series finale, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It definitely fits the season finale archetype. The first fight feels really climatic, like a full cinematic display of Ganon's army. While the last episode does dampen this effect a little bit, the first battle still does not disappoint, ultimately becoming the last great fight of the show. The animation of Link's ghostly self is a bit shaky, but it works well enough to convey the effect. Anyway, Link goes back to his slightly sexist self from the first few episodes in this one. He's kind of a creep in his ghostly form, making fun of Zelda way more than actually trying to help her. So while there is a bit of charm in Link coaching Zelda, they spend more time on Link just creeping than actually giving advice. Before getting to the last part of the series, I really want to quickly highlight this animation error.
And Link is with her. What?
I'm just kind of genuinely curious how it happened. Like, obviously it's not good and it hurts the review, but I'm more curious than critical. Anyway, the ending is a nice idea, but executes that idea rather awkwardly. Revealing that Zelda actually likes Link is not the huge reveal the show thinks it is, and the way they just kind of overhear it is really odd. Link abandoning Zelda right after this feels weird too, and instead of there being any semblance of a fight, Link just zaps the remaining skeletons and bails. I get they needed to show his dominance for the episode to work, but it's just kind of strange. Anyway, the last scene is the best indicator this episode was leading to more, but as of now, we get another failed kiss to close the series. Anyway, in conclusion, I really wanted to love this episode. Like, I was actively hoping this episode would be good enough for a perfect score, but it's just not. Don't get me wrong, it's still good, just not great. The lack of good fights after the beginning, the weird animation, the strange pacing, and the creeping dialogue hold this episode back, but it does get major credit for the aforementioned great opening fight, some still great Zelda and Link stuff, and a good premise. So yeah, there's some good and some bad. It's a mediocre end to the series. Well, somewhat unfortunately, this episode concludes the series. While there were plans to continue the show, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show's cancellation ultimately ended this one as well, leaving us with 13 episodes to dissect. For starters, as I mentioned this throughout the review, but this truly does feel like two different shows, the first three and the last 3 episodes. First, let's talk about those premiere 3 episodes. In these episodes, the main difference is that Zelda just does not requite Link's attraction whatsoever. This makes his advances feel creepier and in turn ruin him as a protagonist. There's also some other stuff in these 3, like the worst example of Sprite, but I've already shredded these enough at the beginning of the video, so let's just focus on the much better second half. Zelda and Link carry this half, and while there's definitely still frustrations in their relationship, when it works, it really works. The other 3 recurring characters are Ganon, who's pretty boring, the King, who's a nice gag character and nothing else, and Sprite, who is the worst. Truly, the only characters that you can connect to at all are the protagonists, whose chemistry is shockingly good for a video game cartoon. Speaking of the show's connection to the games, I'll just be frank. This show is a good action comedy, but a terrible Legend of Zelda show. You can't blame them though. I'm sure had this game come out after Ocarina of Time or even Link's Awakening, it would have been better, but this show came out even before Link to the Past, and given the absence of the Triforce of Courage, it's pretty obvious that most of the show is taken from the adventure of Link. So yeah, any attempt to make a game out of the NES original was never going to succeed see it in today's eyes. Finally, just to slip a few last things in here, the action ranges from slightly above average to bad, and the animation looks somewhat nice, but the animation errors hurt it significantly. The worst evidence of the show's small budget is in the repetitiveness of the soundtrack. Seriously, the same songs play in every single episode, sometimes multiple times. It's not well mixed either, so you just hear overly loud versions of the main theme during every single final fight. But yeah, that's really the last thing I wanted to talk about. As for the score, while I do like the show, the first couple episodes makes it impossible to give it anything above a 6 out of 10. My least favorite episode was Cold Spells, and my favorite was Fairies in the Spring. Anyway, if you guys did make it this far in the video, I have a request. If you know of any really obscure animated shows that are relatively short, please let me know either in the comments or on Twitter. While I love talking about more popular cartoons, I really want to talk about some more interesting stuff, good or bad. So yeah, if you have any candidates for that, please let me know, and I'll give you a shout out if I use your idea. Anyway, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.